Everything you need to know about the Vigo Dem party. So sit back, relax, and watch from anywhere. Get ready for a chat with a chair.
I'm Joe Etling, Chair of the Vigo County Democratic Central Committee. Welcome to Chat with the Chair. We're delighted you could join us. We've got an all-star cast this evening, and we are not going to waste any time. Just get right into our guests. Tell our viewers, not that you need an introduction, who you are.
I'm Dr. Roland Kohr, recently retired, but former Vigo County coroner and medical examiner.
Now, Dr. Kohr, oftentimes people say that we're dying to see somebody. Literally, people are dying to see you over the years, though.
For many, many years, yeah.
And you've got two young men here with you. Should we let them introduce themselves?
Yes, Bob Wright, former Vigo County prosecutor.
And I'm Philip Adler, and I'm former Vigo County prosecutor. Feel like I'm on a quiz show. Which one's telling the truth?
It is kind of like that, so it's...
Let's see, 2 lawyers and a doctor.
Yeah, you got problems.
So, Doctor, if I'm not mistaken, your guests to your right have been kind enough to grace us on the chat in the past here and talk about their background a little bit. This could be your inaugural visit to Chat with the Chair. Am I right about that?
Could be inaugural and my swan song, too.
Well, that's fair. So tell our viewers a little about your background.
Well, I grew up through the junior high and high school years in Bloomington. Did my undergrad at IU Bloomington. Went to medical school in Indianapolis, IU School of Medicine. Residency training at at Methodist Hospital in Indianapolis, and then completion of my residency training, came to Terre Haute, and I've been here the last 37 years.
And what was it that brought you and attracted you to Terre Haute and Vigo County?
Job market was very tight at the time, and I was one of the few people that year to actually get a full-time job in pathology. There were 7 residents who finished their training in Indianapolis, 5 at the Med Center, 2 at Methodist, and 2 of the 7 of us got full-time jobs, and I was one of them. Just happened to luck into Terre Haute where there was an opening, thanks to some missteps by a previous pathologist by the name of Joe Selican.
Well, tell our viewers, though, a little bit about how it was that you elected to pursue pathology and then ultimately forensic pathology.
Well, pathology was not my first choice. My first choice, strangely enough, was medical genetics. I was originally enrolled in a combined degree program where I would have received an MD and a PhD in medical genetics. After the first year of medical training and some exposures, a little bit of clinical things, decided that really was not my cup of tea, so I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and still had 2 or 3 things on the list. Junior year, first day of rotations, I was cornered by the chairman of the Department of Surgery and quizzed. Asked me a question I couldn't answer. He said, well, read up on it. So that night I read up on it, and this is the days where you read from books, not from...
Imagine that.
And this was 1977, and next day he said, what'd you find out? And I told him, he said, not bad, and went off and on this way for about a month. And at the end of the month, one of the interns pulled me aside, says, the chief likes you. If you want to be a surgery intern, you got a job locked up right now. It's 1 month in my junior year, so I was going to be a surgeon, rah-rah. Well, got in the program, and things didn't work out at the end of the first year after I worked basically 9 months without a vacation day or a sick day or anything else. I was let go from the program. It turned out because they had a little meeting where they had to call down from 12 to 6, and where my name was on the list that they were just reviewing, my name was, after they found 6 people they already thought they could keep, hadn't even discussed me. And somebody said, well, wait a second, we've still got to talk about these other guys. And they said, oh no, we got things to do. And so, because of where my name fell on the list for discussion, I was let go from the program, but had found during my senior year, pathology wasn't that bad. I'd done some electives in the subject, really liked it, thought, boy, if I'd known about this earlier, I might have considered pathology, but by God, I was going to be a surgeon. Well, suddenly, with surgery kind of pulled out from under me, called program director of the pathology program I'd rotated with, and they said they'd love to have me on their program, so I entered their 4-year training program. Now, the forensic side was a little bit different. I'd done 1 month of forensic training with Jim Benz, who was the lone forensic pathologist in Indianapolis, late 70s, early 80s. And thought, well, you never know where I'm going to end up as, a pathologist. I may have to do the occasional autopsy for a coroner. First day in Terre Haute, new pathologist on staff. My partner that had hired me introduced me in the doctor's lounge, some new docs, and that very first day, 3 people said, "Oh, new pathologist, ever think of running for coroner?" And after saying no for the 3rd time, I said, well, who knows? And next thing you know, a couple of years go by, there's an election, and then there's a bit of a scandal with the coroner's office where the seated coroner had to resign. I expressed some interest in the office, and my old buddy Bob Wright just didn't respond well initially, but anyway, didn't get appointed in that interim position, but was encouraged by somebody else in this room, Vicki Wager, to consider running for office in the 1988 primary. Ran for office and surprisingly got elected on the unique combination of actually being a physician and being able to do autopsies. And the more I've done it, the more I've enjoyed it. I spent a little time doing a mini fellowship with Dr. Pless to get up to speed before I took office in January of '89. Once I got started with it, really enjoyed it, and there was a unique opportunity. Back then, besides the traditional roles that have now, that you have to go through a 1-year fellowship for certification, back then they said if you did the equivalent of 2 years full-time forensic practice, you could qualify to sit for the boards even though you had not done a fellowship training. So for the next 6 years, averaging about a third of my practice as forensics as a coroner, I proceeded to log in that amount of time. I was also approached by people at Indiana State University about teaching a course on death investigation. Part of that was my chief deputy coroner was a grad student at the time, introduced me to his advisor, who was a professor, and I learned at that point there's no such thing as a free lunch. When people say they want to take you to lunch and talk about something, there's strings attached, and next thing I knew, I had another lunch scheduled with the chairman of the department, and they proposed teaching a full-time course, 3-hour death investigation class at ISU, and started doing that, which forced me to really know the material frontward and backward. There's a famous quote by Thomas Tryon that said, if you would know anything thoroughly, teach it to others. And that's certainly been true through my career, so I was able to pass the boards without a blip. Became a board-certified forensic pathologist officially in 1996, and now I'm one of only about, there's less than 1,000 nationwide.
Wow. So it appears that if your name had been Roland Aardvark, we would have never had your services in Vigo County potentially.
That's quite possible.
Yeah. So with regard to your position and your capacity as a forensic pathologist, how unique that is in the state of Indiana?
Well, right now I can't give you an exact number how many forensic pathologists there are. I'm probably, if not the senior most, but one of the most senior. There's right now, I know of at least 1 or 2 full-timers in Indianapolis, or maybe a third. There's one in Fort Wayne. There's a couple itinerant ones that are traveling the state, go from county to county, sometimes by car, sometimes by plane. But right now, in terms of full-timers, there's probably about 7.
And with regard to your position as the coroner previously, your capacity as a forensic pathologist was again a unique combination.
Well, the last time a forensic pathologist held the office of coroner was John Pless, who was, nationally recognized as an expert. Dr. Pless had been a coroner in Lawrence County, Indiana, before coming to Bloomington, and then in 1983-84 he was recruited to come to Indianapolis to become the director of the forensic pathology program there. And interestingly, after I'd been in town less than a year here, a colleague that I trained in residency with called me up. He was Dr. Pless's first fellow, invited me to come back to Indianapolis and join them as the 3rd member of their team for the long haul. And I said, boy, you called me 6 months ago, you'd had me, but right now I'm invested, I'm sitting on 2 house payments, yada, yada, yada. I really can't pull up roots at this point, but it kind of worked out by the other approach just as well.
And of course, you were successful in your inaugural bid for the coroner's office, but that wasn't the only term you served. How many terms did you ultimately serve as the coroner of Vigo County?
4 terms, total 16 years.
And of course, those had to be interrupted by term limits at a time, but I believe Dr. Amos was serving in the interim when you were not serving.
That's correct, and I had a hand in trying to pick out somebody to succeed me that I thought would maintain what I tried to build for the first 8 years that I was coroner. And Dr. Amos did a more than adequate job at that. I provided as much backup as she needed or requested. We built a good staff of deputy coroners, and I would argue that we've got the finest coroner's office in the state of Indiana and have had for 30 years.
Dr. Kohr was instrumental in bringing this coroner's office out of the dark ages into the light. He did autopsies and provided the records that we needed, as in autopsy records, toxicology records. We did coroner field reports on each one of our cases. It was just an unbelievable chain of events there that once we got started, we just worked our way really up until what it is today. There was no previous records, there was no information. I would get people call me all the time wanting, well, this person passed away and I'd like to go back and look at this record, and I was not able to do that because we did not receive any. Now, as of today, if anybody has died since January 1, 1989, and it was a coroner case, I have that record, and I can provide that to the family.
I was walking down the hall and seeing Dr. Kohr. He was coming out of the morgue, and he says, "Hey Curtis, how you doing?" I said, "I'm doing fine." He said, "How about you being a removal man?" And I looked at him, and I had no clue what he was talking about for a minute. And he said, "I need a removal man. I'd like for you to do that." And he said, "We'll give you 2 weeks." And I do believe in my heart that the good Lord's singing to me, and I've been doing it ever since.
It's never pleasant having to discuss death with family members, but something that I learned just through readings back in the early 80s, Dr. Valdez de Pina was a pathologist, pediatric pathologist, who had started doing something with SIDS deaths. Loss of a child is devastating, especially in infancy with anyone. And she had set up a program where she would have meetings with family members after the autopsy. It's one thing to get an autopsy and just mail a copy to them, and it's might as well be something legalese, like all the fancy words lawyers like to use. But to actually sit down with the family and explain what the autopsy meant, what it implied in terms of preventability, chance of having a second child die this way, and just reassuring parents it was not their fault, was something that she found extremely valuable, and I found as well. And some of my more rewarding experiences over the years have been able to, chances I've had to sit down with family members, and in particular with family members of deceased children, and provide answers and provide comfort so that they don't spend the rest of their lives second guessing what they did, what their own actions were. In particular, I can think of a case that happened, this is probably 15 or 20 years ago. We had a child that was not quite 2 years old, but outside the age range where we would consider SIDS as a likelihood, but nevertheless, an autopsy needed to be done because this child had no prior medical issues. I was called to the emergency room at Regional Hospital, and when I arrived, nurses filled me in on what had happened, and indicated that the mother, who was a single mom, and her father were sitting in the quiet room, and so I went in to offer my condolences and explain to them what was going to have to happen next. And I informed them that we would be doing an autopsy the following morning, and Mom just glared at me and said, "I don't want an autopsy." And I said, "Well, I know you're very upset right now, and I can understand, and I know this is a very traumatic time for you, but this really needs to be done. We have to have answers." And she again looked at me and said, "I do not want an autopsy." I said, "Well, I'm very sorry you feel that way, but by law, I am empowered to authorize one, and it really needs to be done in a case like this. Now, you don't explain to parents necessarily that we've got to rule out child abuse. That's not what they need to hear at a time like this. But that is always an underlying concern, but still you need answers. And so we proceeded, but I understand the woman and her dad left the hospital, traveled down to Sullivan County, met with a judge, tried to get a restraining order. Did not succeed. For obvious reasons. The judges, by that point, had recognized that I kind of knew what I was doing, and if I insisted that we needed one, there was probably a good enough reason. Well, a day or so later, girls in the front office say, Dr. Kohr, you got a call from Mrs. So-and-so on line 1. And I thought, boy, this is going to be a difficult phone call. And I literally held the phone receiver about an inch away from my ear in case she started yelling and screaming at me. Instead, she said, Dr. Kohr, I'm so sorry I acted the way I did the other day. I can't tell you how much it means. I have to have answers. What can you tell me? It turned out this was an exceedingly rare disease process that had been at that point reported less than 40 times in the world. Something called histiocytoid cardiomyopathy. I didn't make that diagnosis by myself. It required assistance from Riley pediatric experts. In fact, it ended up being a published case, although Riley never gave me credit for picking it up. But nevertheless, I was able to reassure the mom what it was, reassure her that it's nothing she'd failed to do as a parent, nothing that should have been picked up by any pediatrician, nobody did anything wrong. It's just one of these rare disease processes that unfortunately had affected her child. And we were able to get her genetic counseling to reassure that the chance of it ever happening a second time was extremely remote. And that kind of convinced me there's times when people are going to think I'm a jerk, I'm an absolute a-hole for insisting on autopsies, but as I've found over the last 37 years, that has never persisted. I cannot think of a single case in this time where patients have stayed mad at me for doing an autopsy, because once the initial shock of a loss, it's over, people need to know and they want to know, and we can reassure them and tell them that wasn't anything they did wrong.
Great story. You know, based on your comments, many people might think that you're not real fond of lawyers, and I just want to be, I just want to be very clear here tonight that you're not. Okay, just so.
Well, like they say, 99% of lawyers give the rest a bad name.
There you go. So, of course, in your capacity as a coroner, you had to work with some lawyers, particularly those that were elected as prosecutor, and given your unique combination of being a coroner, forensic pathologist, you had to work with a lot of prosecutors throughout the area, this state of Indiana, and even in Illinois. But you've got two gentlemen over here that I know that you held in high regard, that you had occasion to work with. Talk about how it was the coroner had to work with law enforcement and with prosecutors.
Well, obviously, most of the cases the coroner investigates have some medical legal significance. Either they're just sudden unexpected deaths, which actually natural deaths count for about half of all the deaths we do, but they still have to have an explanation to put on a death certificate. But the other half that are not natural, we've got to separate. Are they homicide, accident, suicide, or maybe undetermined? And for assistance, we have to work hand in hand with law enforcement. I've got some excellent relationships with many law enforcement. I've had some bad relationships with some law enforcement over the years. And I've dealt with, up till now, right now we're dealing with 13 different counties in this area. That includes 3 Illinois counties, but I've had enough of a good relationship and rapport established with law enforcement that, for instance, several years ago when the murders in Delphi occurred, the 2 young girls, even though it's more than 100 miles from here, state police specifically requested that I do the autopsies, not the person on hand. I've had a similar request for autopsies west of Evansville. We had a triple homicide out of Zionsville several years ago where I specifically requested. So I think the state police have learned to appreciate the work I do, and I certainly appreciate the work they do. So we've worked hand in hand with them. And again, cases that are of criminal nature, which are far exceed the number of civil litigation cases I see, it's going to involve the state of Indiana versus whoever. And so that's where the prosecutors come into play. And we have to learn to work with them and to understand each other. And I'm certainly not a lawyer, but I've been in enough trials now that I can tell you for sure I've been in more trials than the 3 of you put together have been in on autopsies. And so I kind of learned the way it works. And I can anticipate things. I've seen the tricks of the trade. I see the tricks that defense attorneys use over years. And so I've become adept. I like to teach attorneys various things if they've never worked with me before. Because I can say, if you ask a question this way I'm going to have to answer it. If you want me to answer it a different way, you better ask the question a different way. At the same time, defense attorneys are going to like to counteract with something, and this is how you get back. Part of the thing, having taught at ISU for so many years in the criminology department, I've become fairly good at speaking in front of crowds of people that don't have scientific backgrounds. Juries, as any attorney can tell you, you have to assume that they have a 6th grade education and address that level without talking down and making them sound like you're a arrogant jerk because they don't know as much as you do. But the skills I've learned in teaching an undergrad class of people that are not science majors apply very well to juries, and I've become very good, I think, from what I've got feedback from judges at explaining concepts that are very difficult, scientific sometimes, to laypersons, and being able to work with attorneys to do so. One of the things I've taught these guys, and both these two gentlemen realize you get to a point where you need to just kind of take the leash off me and let me run. And so they were both taught, when you get to this point, the questioning, ask an open-ended question, as in, Dr. Kohr, would you please explain to the jury why? And when they gave me that latitude, then I could take off and run with it, as opposed to having to give yes and no answers.
And the Honorable Philip I. Adler, at the end of the couch, he served as Chief Deputy Prosecutor of this county, as well as the elected prosecutor, and served as Superior Court Judge. Judge Adler, you, of course, bring also an interesting background, given that your father was a physician and
My father was a pathologist.
a pathologist. I was getting to that.
He was. And I was a lab technician for 3 years.
And so you bring an interesting perspective, and so talk about your role as prosecutor and how that interacted with the coroner, and particularly with the pathologist.
Well, I mean, as Dr. Kohr knows, as does Bob here, when there's a death, in the prosecutor's office, we want to know what happened, what's the cause. Is it an accident? Is it a suicide? Is it natural? Or is it a murder case? And therefore, the autopsy is so vital for us to make a determination whether charges need to be filed against someone, or in a child case, abuse. The child's not dead, but whether the child's been physically abused. Often, I don't know. Rick, did you get involved in some of those cases? Did the emergency room give you a call or whatever? And
they would, and
show photographs or whatever. So the prosecutor wants to know about child abuse just as much as a murder investigation, of course. And so, I personally know the stresses and strains on a pathologist. Growing up in my father's home, obviously, in Columbus, Indiana, they often call a pathologist the doctor's doctor. Am I right, Rick?
that's right.
Because they seemingly know just about everything about everything. Now, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but they do call pathologists a doctor's doctor. And they got to run the laboratory. They have to do autopsies. They have to testify in court. They have to consult with doctors about diagnosis and things of this nature. It's a very stressful specialty. It really is. And Dr. Kohr obviously meets the definition of a doctor's doctor, and I relied on him, even if he didn't do an autopsy, necessarily in a particular case on a medical issue. I'd read something in a report and I didn't understand it well. He understood it, of course. And way back when I was prosecutor, we didn't have Wikipedia and Google and all the advantages that the internet gives us today. I still would call him anyway, even if I had it, because you can't believe everything on the internet, obviously. And so he was an invaluable asset to law enforcement, to the court system, to the prosecutor's office. And Bob can speak to that just as well as I can, if not better.
By the way, you feel free to ask questions, but we might want to change the sign to chat with Phil instead of chat with the chair. He's asking questions.
That was a short answer.
No, I'm talking about the questions for Dr. Kohr, but that's fine, you're doing great. But just out of curiosity, with regard to your obvious relationship with your father and his background as a pathologist, and you're working in the lab as yourself growing up, How did that allow you to interact? And my observations was that you and Dr. Kohr had a tremendous relationship professionally over the years. Did that play a role in that?
Well, I've always had a very high regard for doctors, period. My father's friends, most of which were physicians. He was a tennis player, I was a tennis player. We played the tennis with a lot of doctors, so I grew up with a doctor's family, so to speak. And I've always had great respect for Dr. Kohr. I remember that when he first ran for coroner, there were very few people in the political community that was supporting of him. Joe Anderson was one, Phil Adler was another, and Ricky Wager was another. That was about it. Am I right, Rick?
That's about it.
That's
yeah.
about
There
it.
is.
And yet,
Ask him the questions.
and despite all that, he won anyway. He was ultimately qualified, forensic pathologist. He ran against a beer salesman. Please. I mean, he did. I'm not making this up. He really did. Right? He did. They sent the beer to the IU Med Center, and they sent the cadaver to the country club at a wedding reception. He got it all goofed around. But we had a commercial like that, which I think was helpful. So the point of it is, I've always had great respect for doctors, and especially to Dr. Kohr, because he was invaluable for me for the 10 years that I spent in the prosecutor's office.
Bob, you followed up Phil in the prosecutor's office. Talk about your interaction with Dr. Kohr over those years.
Okay, my instructions to the police, whoever the police officer might be or whatever department was at the scene of the crime, if there was any chance that this was a homicide, I wanted Rick Kohr called, and I wanted him to go to the scene before the body was moved, if that was advisable.
And why was that?
Well, I mean, he was the expert. He was the one that could look at the body, and he could testify as to what happened after the body. Was the body moved or put in any certain position after the homicide, and after the person was post-mortem? And Rick could do those things, and he did do those things. And the thing that I liked about Rick was that you may not always agree with what he said, but he was going to tell you his opinion, and he had a basis for that opinion. And I had the utmost confidence in him. Virtually every case that he was involved in, I was pleased with what he did.
So as it turned out, of course, he was, Dr. Kohr was obviously other counties were utilizing his services with autopsies, but the fact that he resided in Vigo County, was your coroner, in addition to being a forensic pathologist and performing the autopsies, that had to be a tremendous asset to you as the prosecutor.
Correct. And there were very few instances. The only time that he wouldn't be on the case would be maybe if he were out of town or on vacation or something, and they sent the body to somebody else, which did happen on a few occasions, but very few. I would say that 95% of the homicides that I was involved in the prosecution were the coroner.
Now, with regard to your office and with regard to your investigations, did you gentlemen consider directing people to be present in addition to Dr. Kohr at those autopsies?
I did not care if anybody else was there other than Dr. Kohr. That's who I wanted there. If the body was here, I wanted him to be there doing the autopsy. Yeah.
Typically, there was a detective that would be present at the autopsy, if not more than one. But obviously, Dr. Kohr was the key figure.
Was that ever an occasion, though, that you had deputy prosecutors or yourselves present for autopsies? Would there have been a case or circumstance under which that would have been necessitated?
I never went to, I'm sure I would have been somewhat squeamish about it. Like I can't order an open-faced sandwich. I never went, no.
We're thinking about getting you your own show. I mean, you keep this up, we're gonna get you a plaid jacket and you're taking over. How about that?
I never attended an autopsy.
But we did have on occasion, we would have deputy prosecutors in attendance.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And under those situations, was that at your request, or do you know why that was that they were present?
Usually just because of the comprehensive understanding of what's going on with the case. I mean, one of the reasons we have detectives attend cases and police officers is I wasn't necessarily at every single scene, and there may be other investigative information that they could provide. We need to have an ongoing exchange of ideas and thoughts and work through the process. So, I mean, if the police said, we think this is what happened, they'd say, you know, is this possible? And I'd look at them, well, not really. And I could then direct them for additional, you know, steps they need to take. You know, what else they need to look for in terms of evidence, what questions they might need to ask suspects, which would kind of, you know, set the tone whether they're being, you know, forthright on their testimony to that point. And in some cases, we would have deputy prosecutors attend because they were trying to understand the fullness of the case, the spectrum of the case, and you know, being on hand is kind of, there's no substitute for it. I do recall on occasion having Phil at a site where we were excavating a shallow grave in the southern part of the county, and he arrived because clearly we had a homicide. This was not a graveyard other than an impromptu one, and Phil stood there with the sheriff at the time, and I could tell a whole story about that case in itself.
Yeah.
Well, with regard to, you know, the request that you be present that they made, of course, that impinged upon your personal time and oftentimes probably waking you from a sleep. But what was the significance to you in your role, though, being able to go to a scene where a body was prior to being removed?
Well, it's been said, and this is one of the tenets of the training for the Indiana Coroner's Training Board and for death investigators all over the world, for that matter, is a forensic autopsy really begins at the scene. You've got to be able to correlate what the scene is showing to then interpret a lot of the body changes. And there are some times when I would go to a scene and I'd have one of those aha moments and the cops would be scratching their heads. And it was kind of funny. At times, you know, early on it was amusing because even though, you know, the guy I replaced was not exactly medically qualified, when I first came on, I was an outsider. And the cops didn't necessarily trust me. They didn't know if I knew what I was doing. I was, you know, not part of their inner clique. But when I started showing up at scenes and kind of explaining things to them, they thought, oh, this guy maybe knows what he's talking about. And I can think of a classic scene that's been a great teaching example for years. We had a gentleman found laying dead on the kitchen floor. It was an older house been converted into apartments. And the police had been there about half an hour by the time I arrived at the scene. And they said, we talked to the downstairs, you know, occupants, and they said they'd had coffee with this guy, you know, like 18 hours ago. But on the floor, this guy looked like he'd been dead for 2-3 days. He was obviously in an advanced stage of decomposition. And they're saying just something doesn't add up, and we're not sure why they're lying in the lower apartment, but they're not telling us the truth for some reason. Well, I kind of walked around the scene, looked around, and then I had my aha moment, eureka. And I remember I said to whoever the cop was there, said, oh, this is a great case. Look around and see what's going on. They kind of looked at me and I said, huh? I said, come look around. I said, no, Doc, we give up. Tell us what you're talking about. Well, he was laying about 6 feet away from the refrigerator. Now, people said, refrigerator, what's that to do with it? Well, if you stood in front of a refrigerator and your bare feet, when it's running, it blows warm air. Warm air serves to incubate and speeds the decomposition process. And interestingly, the top half of his body, from like his neck on up, looked like he'd been dead for 3 or 4 days, but from his waist down, like you'd expect, for 18 hours or so. And without having gone to the scene, it would have made no sense. I can think of another scene where I did not attend, but fortunately one of my deputy coroners was observant enough. We got the body in, and the working theory of the police department was this guy had been murdered, and somebody had tortured him by putting cigarettes out in cigarette burns. Yeah, the burns didn't look quite right to be cigarette burns. They were a little bit irregular, jagged looking, and they were only on one surface of the body. And I can't imagine they'd just be on his back and on his front. So I asked, people said, well, when you got there, were there any bugs in the place? He said, yeah, we walked in, flipped the lights on, the roaches just scattered. Well, what looked like cigarette burns were actually roach bites. Very characteristic wound patterns they live in the body. So having seen investigators knew what was doing, photography, being able to communicate those sort of things, or else going to the scene myself would make a lot of difference because, again, I look at things from a different perspective than a police officer does. I once had a conference with a guy who does coroner training nationwide, works with forensic pathology organizations, and we were once discussing, who's the best deputy coroner. And I said, well, I've got a chief deputy coroner's police officer. He goes, I disagree. I said, why? He said, well, the problem is if you got a cop that's a coroner, he's got a cop mentality. Now, there's nothing wrong with the police mentality, but they have one perspective, and they're looking at it from one point of view. So you need a different point of view. You also need a medical perspective. And if you have a coroner that's a police officer, and a detective's a police officer, and somebody else a police officer, they're all looking at it like police officers. And instead, you get somebody that's looking at it from a medical perspective. I'm going to think of things that they're not thinking about. Just gives you more variety. If I see an insulin bottle laying around, I'm going to think something different that may not mean anything to them. If I see certain patterned injuries on them, it may mean something to me that doesn't mean a thing to them. Now, that's why working with police officers, though, is important, because I hear their perspective, they hear mine, and the idea is to make them mesh that, okay, then it all fits. But unless you get both sides of the investigation combined, you miss stuff.
It sounds like if this pathology thing hadn't worked out so well that, maybe a Maytag repairman or exterminator might have been right up your alley. I mean, holy moly. And Dr. Kohr, in your experience then with regard to some of the investigations that you have been involved in, or any that stand out in your mind as being more unique than others?
Yeah, there's a handful that are part of case presentations I've given in my teaching sets for years. And sometimes, things that are incidental to the actual cause of death, like, Mr. Wright has just mentioned, can be very significant. Remember one of the deputy prosecutors, Brad Boo, once told me the next best thing to a confession is a lie. And one case stands out, and says, 20, 25 years ago, a couple, not married, but boyfriend, girlfriend, mid-40s, have been having some problems, and he shows up at the police station one day with his father saying, I need to tell you what happened just so you don't misinterpret this. There's been a terrible accident. My girlfriend's dead. We've been arguing right after making love, and she grabbed a gun, and I was trying to get the gun away from her, and it went off. Well, there's some problems with that story. Number one, the gun went off in the top of her head. And we'd have to explain why we're fighting for a gun on the top of your head. Furthermore, the gun barrel, by the wound characteristics, had been held tightly against her scalp at the time. So it wasn't like we're arguing up here, it's in contact. The position she was laying on a couch was such that all the blood runoff was down her sides, not up front like she would have been upright. So there's no physically way possible she could have been standing and fighting over a gun at the time. She had to be laying down on the couch at the time she was shot. The couch she was on had one of the open, oak spindle type things where you put a gun through between the spindles. So clearly it was a shooting while she was asleep on the couch. But what's more, his story about they just made love, they were able to shoot down because an incidental finding in autopsy was her bladder was full. We're talking 600 milliliters of urine, 20 ounces. No woman would make love with a ready to burst open bladder. That would be so incredibly uncomfortable. So it takes us one or two women on the jury to say, no, that's BS. And just one more thing, just prove that this whole story was a fabrication.
Things that people see on TV associated with forensic pathology and what actually takes place in your office and in courtrooms, how would you say that compares to people who that's their view of what takes place in forensic pathology?
Well, for years, right after CSI came out, I was asked to do a presentation about CSI Terre Haute. And the best way I could address that was a Dave Letterman style list of the top 10 things I hated about CSI. And it was just so distorted. And again, anybody in any profession, you ask them what it's really like versus what TV depicts. And I will ask high school students, was your high school like you see on Glee, or like Saved by the Bell or Welcome Back, Kotter, and oh, no, of course not. And if you ask somebody from a radio station, was it like WKRP? Well, no. And as attorneys, you can all say, does courtroom take place the way you see on TV shows? Well, of course not. And there was even an article in USA Today came out within the first year of CSI saying that they take liberties with the truth. It's another way of saying you lie, but in order to keep storylines moving, they have to condense a storyline into a 45-minute segment to allow for commercial time. But what goes on in these shows is not reality. One police officer doesn't do 16 different things. You've got a division of labor. We have specialists in entomology, specialists in ballistics, specialists in crime scene investigation and documentation, specialists in fibroanalysis, specialists in anthropology, specialists in forensic pathology, and so forth, and they've all got to come together and do their own jobs and build on each other and not just one person doing it all. Cases don't go to trial within weeks after the crime. They don't go to trial sometimes for 4, 5, 6 years afterwards. And so during that time, you've got to kind of build a case, build on what you know, get through all the different arguments, go through depositions on occasion, and then finally be able to prepare a case that you think a jury will accept as being legitimate. And again, we don't try to stretch the truth. I mean, every time I'm on the witness stand, I got to swear to tell the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And I take that oath very seriously. Sometimes in the court they say, so help you God, and sometimes they don't, and if they don't, I add that. But the idea is to be able to explain things, to educate the juries, and one of the things that I found very helpful in the midst of all these CSI-style programs is that if you can educate and involve a jury with what's going on and help them to understand the science, they become much more involved in the case and not as detached. And if I can sit there and explain, well, this is why we see this, and I basically turn the courtroom briefly into a classroom, they're all kind of leaning forward, they're really paying attention, and they kind of follow what you're doing, and they understand it, that you're not just sitting up there and just passing on dictums like the Pope, putting out a papal decree.
Judge Adler, you, of course, are not retired from what you're doing with the courts and mediation, but of course you're no longer in the prosecutor's office. Talk about the experiences that you had and the stresses and all that's involved associated with trying these cases and being inner workings of working in these types of homicide cases and cases with very tragic in nature, and how that affects you, and getting away from doing that, how that is now.
Well, I don't regret being prosecutor for 10 years, but I certainly don't look back and wished I was again. It's a difficult job. A lot of employees, the press is always watching. I had some very notable cases that the courtrooms were full every day. CNN covered one of them, the Bill Benefield case. I felt a lot of pressure in that case, horrible case. John Roe is another one. I mean, people don't come and watch a divorce case. They don't come and watch a car accident case. Not interesting. But when you have a murder case, especially a highly publicized murder case like the two I just mentioned, and Bob had them too, it's a lot of stress because the whole world seemingly is watching. If you make a misstep, it's going to get reported in the press, newspaper, television, radio, whatever it might be. So, I mean, it's a very difficult job. I found it to be. Being a judge, in comparison, I don't think is as stressful by any means. I mean, I was a family law judge. As I said, nobody comes in and watches a divorce case. There are important cases. Of course, you're dealing with children, dealing with people's things, their assets, their liability, or their debts. But I didn't feel the stress nearly as much as a judge as I did it for prosecutor. So I don't regret being prosecutor, but I certainly wouldn't want to be it again.
Bob, you had a little different experience with regard to doing probably a little more defense work before you became prosecutor, and then Judge Adler went on to become a judge, so that wasn't your career path. But what, with regard to your view on those same type of pressures and stresses
Yeah,
that you have?
I think that being prosecutor is an extremely stressful position, but it's greatly helped by people like Rick who can give you professional opinions and you rely upon those professional opinions and the police. But I enjoyed being prosecutor. I liked the trials, particularly about all I ever did were homicides, and I enjoyed doing those and got satisfaction from it. There were tough decisions that had to be made, away from me, in just all sorts of cases that didn't involve homicides or Rick or just two people who were telling a story that were, both of them could have been true, and you've got to maybe make a decision that is going to affect one of them for the rest of their life. So, it is extremely stressful, but I enjoyed it.
And
I define, when I used to make speeches, I would define the prosecutor as the managing partner in the largest law firm in this area of the state. We specialize in only one type of law, and that's criminal law. That's basically what it's all about.
I just wanted to add, I've obviously working with 13 plus counties over the years and many, many prosecutors. I've got a world of respect for these two gentlemen sitting right here because they never shied away from taking a case. That's not always the situation that I've found over the years. You have some prosecutors that you could hand them a case, on a silver platter wrapped in gold foil and, everything short of a confession and, I don't want to risk that one. And these guys, had the gumption to go ahead and take cases even if they knew there was a chance they could lose because it was the right thing to do. And I respected that because I've seen too much of the other stuff where cases don't get prosecuted that should be.
So we haven't heard a lot of attention drawn to it, Dr. Kohr, but we were graced with Dr. Myers coming on to talk to us about what's going on in the coroner's office, and she shared a little tidbit with us that you are technically retired.
Technically. My office at the hospital has been cleared out. I am no longer doing full-time, but I am providing vacation coverage for my replacement. I'm doing legal consulting as requested. Right now I got like 6 different civil cases on my desk that I'm advising, all the way from California to Milwaukee. So I'm going to stay busy. Today I spent 6+ hours on Zoom calls. I'm on the State Child Fatality Review Team. I've newly been appointed to the State Maternal Mortality Review Team. There's 2 subcommittees of the State Child Fatality Review Team, so I'm still involved with reviewing deaths and what we can do to improve the state's addressing the problems, what's killing kids and what's killing pregnant women.
Well, sounds like you may be just as busy as you were when you were the elected coroner.
Except now I'm getting to sleep till at least 8 o'clock in the morning.
So any regrets with regard to your career path, and in particular seeking public office as the elected coroner of Vigo County?
Well, I remember when I first sought political office and, Vicki was advising me, I was very naive, jumped into it. And I remember that evening when the polls closed, coming home, laying on the bed, staring at the ceiling next to my wife, and just tried to wind down from the day and said, I don't care if I win or lose at this point, it's over. I had no idea it was going to be that grueling, and then when I got a phone call saying you're winning, even though the ticker tape across the bottom of the TV screen showed me behind, I said, okay, and then, of course, winning changes a lot of things. But it's been a very rewarding career.
You don't miss the bean dinners and the fish fries so much?
No, not hardly at all.
So, Judge Adler, any parting words for our viewers tonight?
Only I wish Rick all the best for the rest of his career, and if he ever does get retired, like me, which I don't seem to get retired either. I just wish him and his family the very best. He's been a great, great asset to the prosecutor's office, to law enforcement in general, as well as to other doctors throughout this area of the state, if not the whole state. He's just been a terrific help to everyone.
Bob?
Yeah, I would just like to thank Rick for all that he's done for this county, because the general public just cannot appreciate how important it is to the prosecutor and to law enforcement generally to have a coroner who knows more than anybody else in the county or any other person that's going to come into court. And Rick was that person.
Did you ever expect two lawyers that show up and say nice things about you like this? What's going on here?
No, not even my brother.
Dr. Kohr, we're going to give you the last word.
Hey, it's been a privilege to have served the citizens of Vigo County, and privilege to serve with these fine gentlemen as well, and looking forward to maybe enjoying retirement if all the stuff backs off at some point.
So, of course, you were very visible in the community, continue to be, and I know you're very involved with your church and a lot of various civic organizations, and we appreciate all those contributions. But if people aren't able to run into you quite as easily, particularly on the campaign trail, is there any way people might contact you or even to send you well wishes?
Still listed in the phone book. There's an address there.
There you go.
Let me add one thing I forgot to say. A Republican county chairman years ago told me he had some very, very good advice from others in the Republican Party. Of course, Rick's a Democrat, Bob is, and I am Bob's former county chairman. And I said, what was that advice? He said, the advice they gave me is never run anybody against Dr. Kohr. That's a true story. That's a true story.
Well, you came full circle there, right?
I guess so, really, yeah.
That's a good story. Well, I am delighted that all three of you could join us, and this was very informative and entertaining. And of course, we wish all of you the best of luck in your futures here. And Dr. Kohr, with regard to your retirement for public service, we appreciate it. And we are going to pull out the infamous ukulele as we close. But this has been another Chat with the Chair, and we appreciate you being here. And stay tuned for our next show. And in the meantime, stay healthy and stay well.
DEMOCRATIC. Everything you need to know about the Vigo Dem Party. So sit back, relax.